I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back, everyone, to Legal Briefs. I'm Alice, your host, and I'm joined, as always, by my loyal co-host, Brett. Hey, Brett.
Loyal. Yes. Yes. If only you knew what I was doing behind your back, Alice. Maybe you wouldn't use that word, but...
No, you are the most loyal friend, and everyone should know that.
Oh, well, that's very sweet. I appreciate that, Alice. And as always, it's a pleasure to be with you here on Legal Briefs. This is, this is like our 9th or 10th episode now.
This is like a regular show now.
I know. It's not just a new thing.
I mean, what are we going to... it's kind of crazy.
I know. Like the 25 people who listen to us are really enjoying this, so I'm glad.
That is not true. We love all 30 of you.
All 30 of you. And we love bringing you all these interesting cases and cases that you guys ask about. Just want to remind you here at the beginning, if you do have things you want to hear about, make sure you send them to us. Because you probably noticed most of what we talk about is driven by you guys. And that includes the case we're going to talk about today. But before we get into that, I do want to do an Amber Heard update because I thought this was really funny and I wanted to get Alice's take on it. And I haven't actually talked to her about this. Alice, did you see this motion for a new trial that they filed?
I did not. They already filed a motion for a new trial.
So they did on the grounds that one of the jurors who was on the jury was... So apparently the jury summons went out to this 70-something-year-old man, right? Well, the problem was his 50-something-year-old son lives at the same address and has the same name. So it was supposed to go to the 70-year-old, but the 50-year-old got it and assumed it was for him. So he filled out the jury questionnaire. He showed up for jury duty, and he got picked. So he ends up on the jury, and then after the verdict comes down, Amber Heard's lawyers file a motion for a new trial on the basis that he was not properly selected because he had not been randomly chosen for the jury pool.
Wow. That's fascinating.
It is. I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah. How did they find that out?
Well, see, here's the thing. I think they pretty clearly knew from the very beginning because, look, they spent a ton of time and money on jury selection. I mean, they spent money on everything else. You can't tell me they didn't pour over those jury questionnaires. And the guy filled out everything. It was totally innocent. He filled out everything accurately, including his date of birth. So if you had looked at the summons about who you're supposed to be seeing, and you look at what he fills out, you'd know it was the wrong person if you look closely. Well, the judge has actually already ruled on this. And the judge said, without saying, that they knew about this from the very beginning and just held on to it. And now that they've lost, they're like, oh, look, we have a trump card. And the judge's like, no, not going to happen. Basically said, look, this guy, he was honest. He answered everything. You did the whole voir dire with him. He was properly selected. This was just a simple mistake. We're not doing this over because of it. So I thought that was a good ruling by the judge, but I thought that was a weird circumstance. It doesn't come up that often.
Yeah. Well, you know what's so interesting about these is most motions for new trial, though, when they're filed in cases that the true crime community is paying a lot of attention to, I know a lot of people get, if they, for example, want the judgment to stand, they'll be very concerned. Oh my goodness, there were all these arguments. And if you're somewhat of a decent lawyer, if you read the motion for new trial standalone, it should be persuasive because you are supposed to be filing a persuasive piece of advocacy. But almost always a motion for new trial is pro forma because you have had the opportunity to move for judgment at different times throughout the trial. And these arguments have to have been raised before. You can't kind of spring on a surprise last minute. And so most of the time in these motions for new trial, they're actually rehashing arguments that the judge has already ruled upon, which is exactly what happened in this case.
Yeah, so it wasn't that surprising that they didn't win, but it is always fun to follow those little things that happen. I'm sure there will be an appeal of the actual issues in the case. I doubt that one will make much headway with anyone. So that was our fun and frivolous conversation at the beginning of the show. The case we're going to talk about today is awful. I mean, it is terrible. Reading about this case, writing about this case is just, I don't know. It was hard to even really get through all this stuff. I mean, this is one of those cases that really brings out the emotions in most people who hear about it. And what we're going to talk about today is the case of Harris v. State, which is a case out of Georgia that most of you probably heard of. Alice is going to give you a synopsis of the case, but just know going in that this one is brutal, so just be ready for brutal.
It's beyond brutal, Brett. I mean, so you may have heard about this type of fact pattern because unfortunately at this point we've kind of heard this fact pattern before. Justin Harris left his son in his car on a hot day while he was at work. The child died and Justin was charged with murder. The prosecution's theory was that he killed his child so that he could pursue relationships with underage girls. To prove that, they introduced a large amount of sexual evidence, including evidence that Justin had exchanged lewd and sometimes illegal sexual messages and pictures with 4 minors. 9 color pictures of Harris's erect penis that the state extracted from messages and, by the way, blew up to a full page size as separate exhibits, and evidence that Harris hired a prostitute 3 times. Now, the Supreme Court reversed his conviction on 403 grounds.
And you've certainly heard that headline. I mean, it was one of those things that when it happened, it kind of went through true crime. Everybody was very angry. They didn't understand how this conviction could be reversed. And so that's why today we're going to talk about this. This is actually a pretty interesting case from an evidentiary point of view. The Georgia Supreme Court decided this case, and they decided it on some rules of evidence that really come into play in every case you're ever going to hear about, every true crime case you're ever going to watch. You're going to hear about these rules. We've talked about Rule 404 a lot. Today we're going to talk about Rule 404 a little bit because it came into play here as well. But we're also going to introduce this other rule to you that we may have mentioned before, but we've never really dived into, 403. And 403 is really where the action is in this case. So that's the synopsis. That's the overview. That's what we're going to be talking about today. If you don't want to hear about an incredibly tragic case that involves the death of a child in really horrific circumstances, then maybe wait for the next show. But we're going to take you back to June 18th, 2014. And Justin Harris was driving to his office. He was supposed to drop his son off at daycare. This was something that he did almost every day. But for reasons that remain unclear, on this day, he forgot. Or at least that's what he claimed, was that he forgot. That wasn't what the prosecution thought, and it wasn't what the police thought. They thought that he had done this on purpose. Whatever the case, whatever the motivation, whatever the cause, the one thing we can say for sure is that for hours, all day, in fact, his 22-month-old son, Cooper, sat strapped in his car seat until he died of hypothermia. For Cooper's death, Harris was charged with malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, and cruelty to children in the 1st degree and 2nd degree. But that would not be the only charges that Harris would end up facing. During the investigation into Cooper's death, it was discovered that Harris, who was 33, was communicating with underage girls about sexual activity. In fact, the very morning of Cooper's death, Harris was texting with CD, a 17-year-old. He was also communicating with a 21-year-old with whom he'd had a previous sexual encounter, another 18-year-old, and a 23-year-old. One thing we're going to see as we go through this, keeping track of everyone that Harris, who was married with a 22-month-old child, was engaged in various sexual encounters, sexting. It's going to be difficult. Just know that he is prolific when it comes to this kind of activity.
Right. So you can already see that the prosecution is painting a very unsavory picture of Harris in order to paint a motive as to why he would do something like this, not accidentally, but intentionally, by leaving his son in his car all day, leading to his death. Now, if you guys have been listening to our episodes, whether legal briefs or the prosecutors, something should be going off in your head right now, and that's, How do these facts relate to the actual alleged crime here? So keep that question live in your minds as we keep talking about this case. So that morning, Harris was to take Cooper to daycare as he always did. They stopped at Chick-fil-A for breakfast, but then when Harris left the Chick-fil-A, rather than drive his son to the daycare as he did just about every day, he made the 4-minute drive to his office. His son remained in the car when he went inside for work. At lunch, Harris would stop by his car and drop off some light bulbs, but even then, he did not notice his son still strapped to his car seat. By 1 p.m., it was 100 degrees in the car. By 3:30 p.m., it was 125 degrees in the car. During his day at work, Harris continued sexting with various women, exchanging explicit photos. At the end of the workday, Harris got in his car and drove off. At some point after he'd driven off from work, Harris realized that Cooper was still in the car. When he pulled over and laid his son on the pavement to perform CPR, a witness heard him say, "What have I done? I've killed my son."
And look, this is something that happens and happens accidentally. It's one of those things that I hear people sometimes express absolute skepticism that this could happen. But, this is one of those things that sort of terrifies me because you got your kids in the back of the car, they fall asleep, they're totally quiet, you're driving around, you're doing errands or whatever. It is easy to get out of your car and for a split second, forget them. I mean, I have gotten out of my car and started walking away from it and been like, wait a second, I got to get my kid, right? And you go back and get them and it's fine, right? But this kind of thing happens pretty rarely. It's not like it's an epidemic across the country, but every now and then, every year, there are a handful of children who this exact situation happens. The parents are supposed to drop them off at daycare, and instead of doing it for whatever reason, they drive straight to work, and they work in a situation where they're parking outside in the hot sun all day. And as all of you know, you think about this with pets a lot because people used to leave their dogs in the back of the car. It gets really hot in your car really fast, and you can die if you are trapped in a vehicle like that in 100 and 125 degree weather. I mean, that's really, really hot. And particularly if you're a child, you can't call for help or anything. So this can happen. An accident like this can happen. You can question whether or not there's some lower level of negligence or manslaughter that should be applied here, but that is not what the prosecution went for. We're not talking about no matter what, he should have been punished, which you may feel that way, and that's fine. One thing that kind of rubbed me the wrong way about him, the police show up, his son's dead, they arrest him right there. And he's like, "Why are you arresting me? I said it was an accident," which to me, that would not be my response. I don't want to put myself in this man's shoes for several reasons, but I feel like I would be pretty much take me to the gas chamber or the electric chair and strap me in. After what I've done, I don't deserve to live. I certainly wouldn't be quibbling with the police about whether or not I should be arrested in that moment, right? He, being a very self-centered person, obviously did. But the question that really matters here is what was in his heart? What was he thinking? This is malice murder. So, what's in his heart really matters. Was it malice in his heart or was this an accident? And when you got a case like this that literally turns almost entirely on that, you're going to have to, as the prosecution, you're going to have to be creative in how you prove that. Now, there are some ways that you might prove it. Things like were there web searches about how long does it take to die in a car? Something like that. There's nothing like that in this case. So there's nothing that seems to show any kind of premeditation, right? Like that. Nothing like that you're going to be able to point to. Nothing like you had in the Casey Anthony case. No searching for foolproof strangulation or foolproof dying in a car. There's nothing like that. But that's what you're going to have to get to. You're going to have to get to what he's thinking. There was a ton of testimony about his demeanor. There was a ton of testimony about how he reacted. It's kind of like I was just saying about he's getting arrested and he's saying it's an accident. I mean, that was the kind of stuff they're pointing to as evidence. Was he upset enough? Was he too upset? All the kind of things that we always say, we don't put a lot of stock in. That sort of immediate reaction to tragedy. That's really what the prosecution's pointing to. And you've got all these witnesses who don't know this guy at all. And every time the defense would get up on cross-examination, they would say, do you know this man? No. Have you ever seen him react to tragedy before? No. Have you ever seen him at all? No. It's like, how do you know whether what he was doing is consistent with who he is or not? So honestly, not really strong stuff, right? When the best you got is what some strangers are saying, it's not really great. The internet activity, like I said, it doesn't really paint a picture of somebody who's looking to plan this. Like, this was going to be the day, hot day, figured out how long it's going to take, perfect timing, right? Nothing like that. The prosecution was looking at things like which way he was driving home. I mean, they were trying to say, well, he could have gone one of two ways. This way had a little bit more pedestrian traffic. So he knew when he got out of the car, there would be more witnesses to his reaction to finding his son dead. Okay. I mean, that seems pretty weak, right? So what are they going to turn to? What is the thing we've already told you that probably has made you the angriest? While his son is in his car dying, he is sexting with a 17-year-old, right? That's the kind of thing that when you hear it, you think, put him under the jail. Like, who cares, right? This guy is a complete scumbag, and he let his kid die while he's sexting with a 17-year-old. He's guilty. And so that's what the prosecution went with. They piled all of this evidence about everything else he was doing under the theory that he killed Cooper so he could be free to date others. He had told women who had asked him, like, why are you're having sex with everybody under the sun, why do you stay married? And he would say, well, I stay married because I've got Cooper. And since I've got Cooper, I'm not going to divorce my wife. So that becomes the theory of his motive. He wants to get rid of his wife so he can pursue all these sexual adventures. So he has to kill Cooper, which, solid theory, right? But the prosecution had a problem, and it was a big one. The universal opinion of everyone, including the women that Harris was sexting with, including his wife, who had divorced him and really didn't like him very much at this point, was that he loved his son more than anything. Everybody said that. And you could see it in the text. I mean, he's like sending pictures of his, I don't want to get into everything he's sending pictures of. And then on the other hand, he's sending pictures of Cooper and talking about how much he loves him. Right? I mean, that's the kind of thing he's sending to these women. And this just made the prosecution have to really double down. They want the jury to forget that and really focus on Harris's sexual escapades. And this was particularly true of that 17-year-old CD. And in fact, just to make it even easier to impress that upon the jury, the prosecution added charges related to that relationship to the murder charges and tried both cases at the same time. The defense tried to sever these. They wanted to have two trials. They said, look, we don't need to have the same jury deciding whether or not he engaged in all these underage sexual crimes while they're trying to decide whether or not he killed his son. The trial judge said, no, prosecution's saying this is motive. They are intertwined. We're going to try these two things together.
And you can see, even as Brett is pointing out, what is the most salacious detail that we've told you in this story is about his sexting and sexual escapades, especially with the type of women, young underage women. And he's this, father with a young son. And you may be thinking, geez, when does, motive cross over into much too prejudicial for Harris that it would kind of sway the jury unnecessarily? Because I bet you when we were telling the story at the beginning and we talk about him leaving his son in the car and his son dying, a lot of you probably thought, oh my goodness, what a tragic story. We've heard this in the news. It's my worst nightmare that I will close the door on my car, go grab groceries and just forget my child in the car. I think a lot of us have read these stories of accidental deaths for children who've been left in their car seats. But then as soon as we mention his sexting of underage girls, your opinion of him probably switched in a split second and you didn't even know it. So the prosecution did have to get over a hump in order to introduce this sexual evidence because of its prejudicial nature. And so they argued that this sex evidence was admissible under Rule 404B to prove Harris's motive. Now, there's lots of exceptions within 404B. In this case, they just want to show the motive. Why would someone who is universally said by everyone to love his son so much want to take such a drastic action? So that's the prosecution's argument there. And the evidence that they want to introduce as motive included, as we've already mentioned, several girls under the age of 18. There were so many women, in fact, that it's really difficult to keep them all straight. 9 women and girls testified during Harris's trial, and Harris had similar encounters with another 21 women. This is just the ones that we know of. This was in addition to sex workers who Harris had hired at various times. So you kind of are beginning to see a picture of Harris that the prosecution is painting. Almost unsurprisingly here, with all of this evidence, all these women, literally like a parade of 9 women coming in and talking about their sexual escapades or sexual escapade texts with Harris, take the stand and say all this. And the prosecution links the fact that he wants to live this playboy life and his son, Cooper's, all that stands between this playboy life and his own life now. The jury convicts after hearing all this evidence. This case is appealed, as many cases are, and it in fact reached all the way to the Supreme Court of Georgia. When they agreed to take the case, they agreed, for the sake of argument, that this evidence went to motive and therefore could be admitted under 404B. So they didn't even reach whether 404B was correctly ruled upon. They just said, sure, let's give you 404B, that you were trying to show motive. But the problem here isn't 404B. The problem was actually Rule 403. All evidence, regardless of how it comes in, must cross the 403 hurdle. Rule 403 says, quote, "The court may exclude relevant evidence if its probative value is substantially outweighed by a danger of one or more of the following: unfair prejudice, confusing the issues, misleading the jury, undue delay, wasting time, or needlessly presenting cumulative evidence." The Supreme Court decided that this evidence was both cumulative and unfairly prejudicial.
So let's walk through this. So when you have evidence and you want it to come in order for it to be admissible, there's a few things it has to do. Number one, it has to be relevant. That's Rule 401. And Rule 401 says really all relevant evidence is admissible, assuming all the other rules work out, right? All that relevant means is it has to have some tendency to make a material fact more likely. A fact of significance is, I think, how they put it. Very low bar. Can be pretty much any fact that's related to the case. Doesn't have to prove you did it. Doesn't have to be that fact, but really just anything related to the case. So for some reason, for instance, you need to prove the weather, you can bring in those facts. They're relevant. You know, the weather might not always be relevant in the case, but certainly it's relevant in a case like this. So 401's a very low thing. Clearly here, this kind of stuff, it is relevant, and it's relevant, if for nothing else, because you have 404B, which 404 is all about. You can't just bring evidence to make somebody look like they're a bad guy. So we're not just saying you're a bad guy, therefore you committed this robbery. You got to have a reason for it. And we talked about here, it's motive. Yes, it makes him look like a bad guy, but it does it to show a motive. Motive is relevant. So clearly you got 401, you got 404. The problem is 403 is always there. Now 403 is actually a pretty low hurdle. I mean, Alice read it to you. The probative value, so the reason that you're bringing it in, what it goes to show, substantially outweighed by unfair prejudice. So it can't just be prejudice. It has to be unfair prejudice, and it can't just outweigh it. It's got to substantially outweigh it. It's a pretty low bar. Usually you get over it, but here there was just so much. It's really the cumulativeness of it and the unfair prejudice put together, because the court said, we're not saying you couldn't do it at all. The court's like, look, some of this could have come in. The messages he was sending the day of the death, those are admissible. That's your motive. Those are pretty bad anyway. That could have come in. You could have used that. But when you're admitting everything, all of these sexual escapades in the months and years before Cooper's death with every woman that he had ever done anything with, you know, it wasn't good enough just to have one picture of his penis. We got to have 9 of them and we got to blow them all up. You know, I mean, like that was too far. It was just too far. And it's almost so absurd that you can see why it was too far. It's hard to imagine that they really thought they were going to get away with this. And I get it, because the state really wanted to show that this was the reason. And this was really all the evidence they had. And they really had to show that Cooper was this obstacle to just this playboy lifestyle. But that made it even worse in the end for the state. The fact that the state really, really needed to do that made it harder for the court to sustain the conviction. The court wrote, without evidence that appellant viewed Cooper as an obstacle to his sexual conquest, appellant's obsession with having sexual liaisons with many women lacks a logical and necessary link to the alleged crimes against Cooper. The one thing they were missing was actually showing what they said the evidence showed. Step 1, it's like the underwear gnomes, right? Step 1, lots of sexual escapades. Step 2, question mark. Step 3, murder, right? Step 2 needs to be, and in order to continue those, must get rid of Cooper. Then Cooper dies, right? Then you got a nice chain and all of this comes together. And even though it's cumulative and there's a ton of it, you could say it was relevant. Otherwise, it's just bad stuff you're throwing at a wall and you're never connecting it to anything. It's like the JFK murder. If after JFK dies, the police were like, well, let's find a guy who's a communist and hates the government and is a segregationist and is all these bad things, and we'll just accuse him of the murder and we'll use all that evidence against him. But we'll never actually connect him to the crime in any way, right? Like all that evidence that might go to motive, if you don't ever actually connect him to the crime, put him in the building, give him a gun, something, then it's just, we want the jury to hate this person and convict on that basis. And that's really what they had here. They were just never able to make that link between what they were showing and the actual crime.
And you can see why this is incredibly important, right? This is why 404B and 403 exist. They exist so that you can't just dredge up every bad thing any person has done. Because guess what? If anyone had a detective sicked on us for the worst things we've ever done in our life, there will be a litany of things. You couldn't have enough paper for each individual person if that is the aim, to pull up everything. But if there's no tie to the crimes which you are alleged to have committed, then it should have no place, right? This is why past convictions are not supposed to be brought in. So just because you've been convicted of other crimes in the past should not bear on whether you committed the crime at hand. The same reasoning goes here in terms of what is fair. So the Supreme Court said this serious unfair prejudice wholly outweighed whatever minimal probative value appellant's sexual interactions with minors had in establishing the existence of the first link, and only the first link, of his alleged motive for killing Cooper. This was precisely the sort of evidence that Rule 403 exists to exclude. Matter of scant or cumulative probative force dragged in by the heels for the sake of its prejudicial effect.
It worked, right? Not only with the jury, but with everybody listening. Like everybody's upset that this guy got off. I mean, he didn't get off, number one. Number one, he was convicted of all the sexual stuff with the minors and was given a pretty hefty sentence on that. There was no appeal. That conviction stands. The prosecution can retry him. They can use the text messages from the day of if they want to do that, and they can try again, and maybe they'll win. But all this other stuff isn't coming in. But nevertheless, to the extent that his conviction has been overturned, people are pretty upset about that. And you can see why, because he just seems like a real scummy guy, right? And if your child dies a horrible death in the car while you're sexting with a 17-year-old, it's just hard to really care whether he's actually guilty. And that's exactly the problem. It's the problem that courts have seen again and again and again. And they've always said, if a jury is going to convict somebody because they're a bad guy, not because they're the bad guy who did this thing, that's a problem. That's not justice. And that's what the Supreme Court of Georgia is doing here. And look, I think this is a pretty brave opinion by the Supreme Court of Georgia because not popular, right? Not a popular defendant. In no way is this a popular opinion, but honestly, I think they got it right. I think on the law, when you read the facts, it's just almost comical what the prosecution did in this case. And it's just not surprising that at the end of the day, the Supreme Court did what it did. And I think they got it right, as much as it irritates me to even say that. As I said, this person will remain in jail on the sexual activity convictions for a while, and we'll see what happens with the murder, whether he is retried or not. But obviously, a tragic case, no matter how it ends up.
Indeed. So I know this has been in the news a lot. I hope that explains the overturning of the conviction from the Supreme Court of Georgia. And if you have more questions for us, let us know. This is such a tragic case. And just as a PSA, if you have young children, I think all of us think that it couldn't be us, but just be careful, take whatever measures you need to make sure that you are cognizant of who's in your car who may not be able to speak up, whether it's small children, sleeping children, animals, and say something. If you're in a parking lot and see someone in the back of a car, it doesn't matter if it's for a second. Sometimes people say they'll just do something for a second and then they're pulled away and they are away for longer than they expect. So be vigilant for each other as good neighbors. And thank you guys for tuning in for this episode. Before we sign off, Brett, do you have anything to add?
I think you said it well, Alice. Just those of you who are always worried about the system, this is an example of the system working, so I hope you're happy.
It's been a pleasure as always, Brett, but until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. You okay? Are you on the mend?
I'm on the mend.
I'm really glad to hear that.
I mean, whatever. It is what it is.
Not whatever. Because when you're not at the office, it's not fun for me.
No. Well.
It's just the truth. Don't flatter yourself. Did you have a JFK example?
I already did it. Clearly, you were listening very closely to my impassioned explanation. I was listening. You said so many great things to say. Anyways.